Hello, everyone, and welcome to this GPAC's webinar on the overt and covert ways that the U.S. exports violence around the world. GPAC's is the Green Party U.S. Peace Action Committee, for those who aren't familiar with us. We developed this idea soon after Election Day, 2024, but we could have done it before the election. Since Inauguration Day, the global picture has changed some, if not in reality, at least rhetorically. Much of what the U.S. under Trump is going to do is at least visible, even if it may change on a daily or hourly basis. But as Greens, we need to be aware and not to be afraid to continually say that one party, the Democrats in this case, paved the way for what Trump will do. So we have a uniparty, a duopoly, but some of us have started calling it a uniparty. For example, with respect to Gaza, for the past 15 to 16 months, the Democrats have supported an ongoing genocide against the Palestinian people. Photos, videos, and reports of from humanitarian organizations make clear the nature of the devastation. Additionally, under Biden, several plans emerged for redeveloping the Gaza Strip for the benefit of illegal settlers. But the media today focus almost exclusively on the words of Jared Kushner and ignore the plans formulated under Biden and the Democrats. But if not for the past 16 months, Kushner and all couldn't speak about the illegal plan to forcibly displace Palestinians from their homes in Palestine or in Gaza. And then, of course, there's Ukraine and the U.S. public programmed once again to make Russia into the aggressor and not recognize the actions taken by the U.S., both covert and overt, from 2014 on, killing diplomacy and eliminating the possibility of a negotiated settlement. And that's not even mentioning Venezuela and Central and South America. We are glad to have a distinguished panel here to discuss these global hotspots and possible actions we can take together to build coalitions and prevent more death and destruction. Today's format will be as follows. I will moderate the first half, and my other half for tonight, Nora Corey, will moderate the second half. And so I will introduce the first two speakers, and she will introduce the second two speakers. And then so we will then moderate, both of us, a question and answer session. Your questions should be submitted to the chat with the word question written in front of them to make it easier for us to identify and to spot questions in the chat. After that session, we'll have closing statements from each of our panelists, but in reverse order from the way we open up. Closing comments and goodbyes from the co-moderator. Oh, the comments will be just 2 minutes each. Okay. And Jim Beckland will be our timekeeper. So having said that, let me introduce our first speaker. It's Matthew Ho. We're delighted to have Matthew here. And Matthew is the Associate Director of the Eisenhower Media Network. Matthew resigned in protest from his post in Afghanistan with the State Department over the U.S. escalation of the war. That would be in the early 2000s. He advocates a foreign policy centered on diplomacy, human rights, and international cooperation rather than militarism. He is a disabled veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps who served in Iraq and just came back from a trip both to Palestine, just November, he told me. So to me, that's recent, but just came back in November from a trip to Palestine and to Ireland. Matthew, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Madeline. I appreciate that, and I appreciate this panel being organized and me being a part of it. It's good to see a lot of familiar names and faces in the gallery here, and so it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be doing this. This is a big topic. There's a lot that can be said. I'm going to try and keep my comments to just one specific area, but certainly I think as we go forward, the breadth and scope of this will be expounded upon. So this idea of covert action, where I'm coming at it from is looking at the U.S. empire in the way that the sociologist Michael Mann viewed empire as having four principal aspects of power, right? Military, political, economic, and ideological. And for me, and I think for Mann as well, and for many others, the idea that the ideological line of power is the most dominant, is the most important for empire is certainly the case. I certainly believe that the ideology, the information, the culture, the theology of empire is the most important thing to sustain an empire. If you think about the Romans, how important Romanization was for the Roman Empire, right? For the Brits, how important Anglicization was for the British Empire in terms of not simply its expansion, but its sustainment over centuries. And I think if we look back at the American Empire, particularly post World War II, Cold War up through the modern era, it's hard to argue that the Americanism that has spread around the world, right? The theology of America, that of the leader of the free world, is certainly as important, if not more important, than say the military, economic, and political lines of power that the U.S. empire exerts, which is saying a heck of a lot, right? Because the U.S. empire has 800 military bases around the world. We have the world's reserve currency. We set up the world economic order in our favor following World War II. We established all these political institutions, including the United Nations, that we have a veto control over, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So to say that the ideological line of power is the most important for the empire, I understand to be saying quite a bit. So I also found it interesting, though, as I was kind of getting prepared to talk to you all tonight, I went and looked at some of the founding documents for the American Empire for the modern era, right? So post World War II, looked at National Security Act of 1947, National Security Council Memorandum of 10/2 of 1948. Also, National Security Council Memorandum 68. And those are the three most pertinent to what I want to talk about. And those really established the form of the American government as well as to its motivations, its intents, and its goals. But looking at NSC 10/2, which authorizes covert action, essentially, it is what gives the U.S. Intelligence community the license to do what it does. And importantly, it also authorizes plausible deniability as a key aspect of covert operations. So effectively legalizing, if you will, the ability of the U.S. government to lie. So this idea that when you're confronting the American government with its own secrets, American government officials and their contractors are essentially duty bound to lie to protect those secrets, right? But interesting thing about NSC 10/2 is that as you read it and it spells out what are we authorizing here? What are these covert operations? The first thing it says is propaganda. That's the first thing NSC 10/2 lists as propaganda. And I'll say, as an aside, one of the things I saw in Iraq and Afghanistan when we would conduct operations to go after resistance forces is very often our special operations forces would target their, what we would call propaganda, their communications, their public relations people in the first tranche of an assault because we recognized how important what the propaganda, communications, public relations, et cetera, were for the resistance. So it's effective, it's meaningful, And I think the two things I want to speak about in my time here is the role of this covert action in media and how it's not as explosive, right? It's not as violent. It's not as apparent as, say, the Maidan coup of 2014, right? Or other things. But however, it has an impact. It gets back to this line of what's most important for the empire. So you look at media and you look, I can divide it into two, one, the news media into Hollywood, essentially. And certainly, I think looking at, again, the post World War II period, the dominance of American news media and Hollywood, not just on American citizens, but on the world's population is clear, right? The role of the CIA with the news media is well known, well understood. In the late 1970s, we had some of the most high profile exposés. You had the Church Committee in 1975, but you also had some very serious reporting coming out of the New York Times, Rolling Stone, that talked about specific programs the CIA launched. You had a high profile biography of the publisher Catherine Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post, published that essentially alleged this as well, that the Washington Post was a front for the CIA. Right. So, one of the things that comes out of this is this understanding in the late 70s of Operation Mockingbird, which many of you have probably heard of, which essentially states that about 400 journalists up until that time, so mid 70s or so, had conducted operations for the CIA. And it's important to say operations for as opposed to just passed along information. Because later on, what you'll see in the early 80s is Ronald Reagan's director of Central Intelligence, William Casey, make that famous quote. Again, something you all probably heard before. But, Casey said in 81, we'll know our disinformation program is complete when everything the American public believes is false. Right. So you see that divided essentially into two different paths here. One, the direct working relationship, the ownership, if you will, of publishers, journalists, media outlets by the CIA and other American intelligence services, and then the more passive role of just providing information that is duly reported by the news media. Certainly we don't have to look much farther than our own experiences 20 years ago. Looking at how the American media, and to a larger part of the international media. When I say media, just to be clear, I'm speaking about the corporate legacy traditional media in the United States. But go back to 2002, 2003, you can see how effective that was in the selling of the Iraq War to the American public, right? You get to the point whereby mid-March 2003, you've got polls registering support for the invasion of Iraq between 72 and 82%, depending upon the poll, right? So very effective. And then that continues, even when that's exposed, and even when all the lies of the Iraq War are exposed. That it's so seeing how willingly and obviously knowingly the news media in the U.S. went along with the U.S. intelligence services. It still continues. In 2014, The Intercept does a story, and they've got all these documents that go back and forth between news media and the CIA. They essentially put in FOIA requests to the CIA. And so a lot's blacked out. But what you see in these FOIA requests are a relationship, an obvious relationship between the CIA and these journalists. And the most incredible example, the one that sticks in my mind, the first thing I thought about when I thought about talking about this was of Ken Dillian, who wrote at that time for the LA Times. And so in 2014, The Intercept publishes his emails with CIA. And he's essentially saying, can you clear this story for me? Right. And this should have been a
Excuse the
huge.
interruption, Matthew, but you have a minute to wrap up your thoughts.
I thought we had 10 minutes.
Yeah, it is 10 minutes. You've done 9 already.
Okay. All right. So I looked at the clock wrong. Okay. All right. Well, thanks. So anyway, Dillian is now the NBC News reporter covering intelligence and justice. And then, even let's look now at the Washington Post, look at what David Ignatius and Josh Rogan write. It's clear that the relationship still exists. And then jumping, over to the entertainment side, in 2016, you'd had already 2,000 television shows and movies that the Pentagon and the CIA have worked on. And of course, there are some really obvious ones, some high profile ones, Argo, Zero Dark 30, Homeland. I mean, those are easy ones that are identifiable, and there's other ones that are not so identifiable. We can get that into the questions. But essentially, it gets back to this idea of using the intelligence services to assuage, to manipulate, to inform the public conscience, tell people what they need to understand, how they need to understand it, what the world is like, right? All to bolster that imperial line of power, right? That ideology, and to cement in place this idea that the United States is the leader of the free world. And then so I'll leave it at that. I'm sorry I spoke too much in the beginning there, I guess, about different things. But I appreciate being here with you all, and I look forward to the other, other folks presenting.
Yeah. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you, Matthew, for being considerate of our time limits. I know you have a lot more to say, and I think most of us in this room have a lot to say about how the media's propaganda has influenced our work over the last number of years, and the things that we have to fight against when we talk about peace between Russia and Ukraine, for an example. So our next speaker is Butch Ware. And Butch is a lifelong activist and educator, specializing in the history of empire, colonialism, genocide, and revolution, all things we need today. He is an associate professor of history, Black Studies, and Islamic Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Butch has been working as a public intellectual, activist, artist, and organizer, supporting communities across the country and around the world to challenge imperialism, ethnic cleansing, and endless war, and to build sustainable, just, peaceful alternatives rooted in African, indigenous, and Abrahamic traditions. As most of you probably know, he was also Dr. Jill Stein's vice presidential running mate in 2024. And many of us have heard you on several occasions and can't wait to hear what you're going to share with us tonight. Welcome, Butch. You have 10 minutes.
Wonderful. And I'll set my alarm. I was more than willing to give Matthew 2 minutes of my time because I wanted to hear more from Matthew. So I hope we leave plenty of time for him to educate us in the Q&A. I'll try to be brief. I'm going to speak as a historian and as a moral human being. And then I'm going to come with a call to action as I get to the close of my 10 minutes. First, just a bit of context. It's great to see you, Jill. I know you just turned your camera off. Before Jill invited me to join the campaign, we did an Instagram Live, and the way that she persuaded me to join the campaign was with two things that she said. She said reparations need to be paid to the descendants of the enslaved in cash. That had me at hello, but she closed the deal when I asked her, what is your position on American foreign policy? She said, my position on American foreign policy is that the goal is to dismantle the American empire. And when she said that, I knew we had business to transact. I knew that we were on the same road. And I said in response, yeah, and you better hurry up and do it quick before somebody does it for you. And what I meant by that was that making a choice, a political and moral and ethical choice to repurpose the trillions of dollars that are wasted on this vast imperialist project, which sows death and destruction across the globe as it impoverishes us here, is all that can be done, really, to keep America from falling into chaos as this empire enters its inevitable decline. So you choose to dismantle the empire, or you have someone do it for you. You have someone do it for you through BRICS. You have someone do it for you through military interventions. You have someone do it for you with a fascist strip down of all of the constituent parts of the American democratic experiment and their sale off to the highest bidder. And that's exactly what we are seeing from the dog team, Elon Musk. I won't pronounce it the way he wants me to pronounce it. The team that Musk has inside the White House. We have this dismantling of the state. So a few things just quickly on this point. Gaza, of course, is a sort of apotheosis of this American empire. And when we speak of American empire, let us be clear of what we speak. We are talking about the greatest single instrument for surveillance and death dealing that has ever come into existence in human history. There has never been an instrument more dangerous than the American empire in all of human history. So that means that there is a moral imperative for us to rein in the harm and to take whatever action we can in order to resist this empire. And as I said, I'll close with a call to action in 6 minutes and 42 seconds, just so that I don't get cut on my time. So if you've heard me speak before, you've heard me talk about the role that Malcolm X played in my own personal journey, to find my own faith tradition as a Muslim, and also my journey to find the Black radical tradition in which I root that resistance. And when we talk about the apotheosis of this empire in Palestine, and especially in Gaza in this current moment, Malcolm educated us on this. The Black radical tradition educated us on this and caused us to bring together a couple of key pieces of that ideological apparatus that is so important that Matthew has described. Malcolm described Zionism as white supremacy. And it's important to understand that when we talk about the fight against the American empire, we are talking about the fight against a white supremacist empire. James Baldwin made the exact same equation. He said the state of Israel, he said this in 1979, open letter to the born again. He said the state of Israel was not created for the salvation of the Jews. The state of Israel was created for the salvation of Western interests. And we know that the Zionists themselves, like Herzl and Jabotinsky and others, were explicit white supremacists, that we are fighting against a moral rot, an evil empire that is rotten at its core, that continues to replay the same historic script that as a historian, I've been teaching about for 20 plus years now. First, we had the Spanish, then the Portuguese, then the Dutch, then the French, then the British, and now the United States of America, each in turn taking the mantle of a capitalist, extractive, imperial state with white supremacist ideology at its core. And that's why it is not accidental that people like Musk would rise up out of it, not accidental that people like Trump would rise up out of it. As we fight against empire, so too must we fight against those concomitant forces of capitalist exploitation and also white supremacy, because these are key ideological pillars. And it's not an accident they are stripping away the teaching of Black history so that you don't know what Malcolm said, so that you don't know what James Baldwin said, so that you don't know that Kwame Ture stood against this, or even that King did. That we are rooted in the genealogies of people who have struggled against this multifaceted, murderous imperial state, which brings us to the second part of it, which is this has always been an imperial boomerang. That whatever has been done to Gaza, it has been a laboratory for what is coming next to us. all of the instruments of surveillance and death dealing that have been deployed abroad find their way back home. And you can talk about this through the policing in a town in California like Berkeley, Augustin Bull himself fighting a counterinsurgency against Filipino nationalists, and then bringing those exact techniques to the Berkeley Police Department and unleashing those. SWAT teams being released on Black and brown communities throughout the 1970s and 1980s, coming right out of trainings in Vietnam, that whatever we permit the empire to do against others abroad, the empire will do to us here at home. And some of us tasted on our skin early as Black and brown people, but we have to understand that as the empire enters this terminal phase, it is going to go through an extinction burst. It is going to be all the more ruthless and brutal in its repression of all of us. So we have to be fighting shoulder to shoulder against all of the internal manifestations of this corrupt, expansionist, imperialist apparatus. It's a genocide that's taking place in Palestine, not just Gaza, of course, the West Bank as well. But it's a genocide that is only awakening a new generation to what other generations have learned in Vietnam and in Iraq and in Afghanistan, which is what I said before, that this is an instrument for dealing death, and it must be reined in as a moral obligation for all morally conscious human beings, which brings us to two things, the last two things in my last 2 minutes. The first, as a Muslim, as a believing person, I study the Quran, I study the Bible, and across all of our faiths and our secular philosophies, there is a single universal truth that unites them all. All empires fall. Nothing that is attained by brute force and power can ever be held. So we have to operate with the understanding that this empire is doomed. And then the most important question becomes, then what shall replace it? What are we building as an alternative? How can we hasten its demise, ease that landing, repurpose those wasted and squandered resources so that we can invest them in affordable housing, so that we can invest them in universal health care, so that we can invest them in an infrastructure instead of spending $1.3 trillion of our congressional budget blowing kids blowing kids up in other countries in their sleep. And that brings to the call of action. I'm running for governor in the state of California. And the reason why I'm running for governor in the state of California, first of all, this is a state that needs to be liberated from all of those corrupt forces. And it is a state that is run by Team Blue, not Team Red. Just to go back to where we were before, this is not an over there Republican problem. This is a duopoly problem. This is a problem that is a function of the corporate takeover of both of those parties. And we must resist because our survival is at stake in the affair. And I'm running for governor in the state of California with a simple ask, is that the state can divest from the genocide machine. We've already seen Alameda County divest. We've seen multiple municipalities divest. We've seen multiple university campuses divest in whole or in part. Now, I plan to make this divestment from the war machine a key piece of our platform, but especially to tether together that external platform with all of the ways that we can actually provide benefits for our citizens in the here and now if we reorient our priorities to serving our communities rather than to squandering these resources on a doomed empire. I know I'm over time, so I'll say one last thing about this. Wherever you are in, somebody's probably zooming from overseas, but wherever you might be based in these United States of America, this is not just a California issue, and this is not just a Green Party issue. I chose to run in 26 so that we could keep the foot on the gas and continue to apply pressure. We emerge from this last electoral cycle in a third position. Yes, it's a distant third, but we are best positioned to build and consolidate power in a third party alternative that will actually give us the power that is needed to intervene, to put brakes on this empire, and to have grown-ups in the room when decisions are being made about humanity's future. So I call everybody into this room into action, to activate your communities, bring me to your town. The fundraising, the volunteer effort is nationwide, not just in California. And with that, I'll cede my time.
Yay. Thank
I
you
was,
so
I wanted to introduce you, Nora, so wait just one moment. Okay. But I was muted, so, so the next half of our program will be moderated by Nora Corey. I didn't fully introduce myself either, so I just want to say I'm a co-chair of the GPACs and a longtime environmental and peace activist, and I am calling in from the country of Colombia. So yes, it is an overseas movement. People here concerned about extractivism and the long arms of the US empire. Nora Corey, who will take us from here, is a Palestinian human rights activist and community organizer based in Oakland, California. Over the past 2 decades, Corey has dedicated herself to advocating for Palestinian rights. And why does this go off when I need it? Palestinian rights. And serving as a campaign strategist and organizer. She has lived and worked in occupied Palestine and in Egypt, gaining firsthand experience in the region's complexities. Go ahead, Nora.
Thank you, Madeline, and thank you, Green Party Action Committee, for bringing us together today. It's such an important time to be gathering as these attacks seem to be coming so fast and furious that we can hardly keep up. And, you know, I think that is by design to throw us off balance. So the most important thing we can do at this time is just to come together to try to understand what's going on and find a way forward together collectively. Just, you know, so much to say, like all of the speakers have, you know, sort of set up the context, but I just wanted to sort of ground us in this moment. To be clear, like what we are witnessing currently is the throes of a corporate coup backed by both parties that have brought us to this point, which is the rapid acceleration of the failing empire. And this historic moment is a convergence of imperial crises and catastrophes. But if we can move past the overwhelm, fear, and paralysis, it is also a time of great opportunity. So how do we get here? Just want to say, give a little brief historical context. Following the brief period after US lost the war in Vietnam, it's been in a state of perpetual war, 97% of time, or 242 out of 249 years of its existence. The American Civil War was the most recent war fought on American soil, ending in 1865. Since then, I would argue that America's largest export has been its imperial wars and weapon of propaganda, exploitation, death, and destruction, with the single most defining goal being to maintain global hegemony and resources. And it has largely succeeded, at least in the first half of the 20th century. So I was fortunate to go to San Francisco State in the mid-90s during the peak of the gains made during the historic Third World Strike that led to the first College of Ethnic Studies, where they taught us the truth about US foreign policy and its foreign interventions, which involved rigging polls, supported military coups, channeling resources and funds from Latin America, Africa, Asia, and the Arab world by using covert ops with the help of institutions such as CIA, FBI, World Bank, IMF. While domestically, this was supported and upheld by the Iron Triangle, the Pentagon, and military contractors, alongside with the Congress and media. So today, the resistance to all of this is the resistance in Gaza and the genocide has torn off the plastic imperial mask. The second Trump presidency is the culmination of over 3 decades of continuous imperial war, and Palestinian is on the front line fighting against this global empire, imperial beast, and has revealed the utter failure of the liberal democracy. And the plan laid out by Trump has revealed the rot within Western capitalism and has made it a sheer mockery of the Western rules-based order. Just as the courts and institutions have stood impotent in the ability to end the genocide over the past 16 months and 75 years. And as Malcolm often reminded us, that the chickens would come home to roost and that the pursuit of imperialism would exact an enormous price at home. Today, they're attempting to roll back all of the gains that we have fought for during this period. And now the illusions of freedom, loving, human rights, supporting Western rules-based order are no longer even given lip service by liberal institutions as the emperor stands buck naked in front of the world. Meanwhile, the people as people stand up and speak out at home, cracks down on people, freedom of speech, students, journalists, and activists continue to be on the firing line for speaking out. And Trump just says the quiet parts out loud, right? He's just unmasking the illusion developed over this century. The status quo, is a failure, and America's revealed it's a full-blown kleptocracy for the very rich, and everything else is
You have 1 minute to finish up your thoughts.
So just that the two-party ruling system parties have brought us here. It's not only the wealth that's being stolen, but our liberty. And the world that we live in is just the increasing mix of turbulence and transformation. And many of us are asking, where are we headed? What we can hope for is multipolar world where, there's equity and sharing of power between the nations of the world. I think it is a multipolar world is a historic inevitability, and it's also becoming a reality. And the extent to which we can support other nations is, critical in terms of building our solidarity. Just wanted to say, in closing, I'll add more of the call to action, but it is the worst of times and it is the best of times. So what we can do right now is join the Green Party, support Butch's campaign, and continue to build solidarity with workers and students and academics that have been targeted and retaliated against for speaking out. So many times these folks have been left to hang dry and need our support. So if you are a worker that has been retaliated against, please reach out to me. And we're building like some mutual aid networks and ways to support and, come together to find ways that we can support you. So I think that's going to be critical that we have these support networks and mutual aid processes in place in the coming year, so that we're not isolated and paralyzed by fear. So with that, I would like to introduce our next speaker, and I'm excited to introduce Daniel Kovalik, a human rights lawyer and author, a strong critic of U.S. interventionist foreign policy. He opposes regime change operations, economic sanctions, and military interventions, arguing that these tactics often violate international law and worsen conditions in affected countries. Kovalik emphasizes the importance of respecting national sovereignty and addressing global issues like poverty and inequality through cooperation rather than coercion. Daniel, please take it from here.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. I'm very honored to be with all of you this evening. So I want to talk about, I just returned from Lebanon and Syria. So I'd like to talk about those two countries. I'll start with Syria. First of all, you know, it was interesting. Was it last week or the week before? Tulsi Gabbard was, you know, she had her confirmation hearing, and I believe one of the senators said, you know, he accused her of, promoting Putin talking points, including one that Obama had supported, jihadists in Syria. And, she stood her ground on that issue. Whatever you think of her on other issues, she was good on that. And of course, it's true. So let's start. I mean, so if you're not aware of it, in December, Bashar al-Assad was overthrown by a group now called HTS, but it's basically an Al-Qaeda offshoot. It is known as the al-Nusra Front. And it's been fighting in Syria since it's about 2011 with the strong support of the United States. And so the U.S. was successful in this regime change operation, bringing Al-Qaeda into power. Now, it should be said that at the moment, the U.S. is saying they're not sure if this group can properly rule Syria. Of course, that is a huge question. But this is the fruits of what was the most expensive regime change operation of the CIA to date. They spent $1 billion a year on this regime change operation over 15 years or so. So it was easily $15 billion. But it goes way back before that. An article I would really urge you to read or reread. You may have read it before, but may have forgotten about it. Is Seymour Hersh's article from 2007 called "The Redirection," and he had that published in the New Yorker magazine. By the way, he since that time was progressively pushed out of the mainstream press. He went from the New York Times to the New Yorker, and then to the London Review of Books, and then to a German publication, initials DW. Now he has a Substack. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who could not find a home in mainstream Western press. And why? Because he spoke some very painful truths. So in 2007, in this article called "The Redirection," he pointed out, or he revealed, that beginning at least back to 2005, the Bush administration went from opposing Al-Qaeda post 9/11 to supporting Al-Qaeda. Because after the war in Iraq, which overthrew Saddam Hussein and his Sunni minority government, the majority Shia came to power. And quelle surprise, the U.S. was surprised that Iran, therefore, benefited from this. So then they decided, okay, forget about Al-Qaeda. We're worried about Iran. We're worried about Syria. We're worried about Libya. We're worried about all these other countries, which, by the way, were all mortal enemies of Al-Qaeda, including, by the way, Saddam Hussein. So then they began arming Al-Qaeda to overthrow these governments that it wanted to overthrow. And they began, first of all, supporting jihadists in Libya to overthrow Gaddafi. And of course, you had the NATO aerial campaign, which lasted from March of 2011 to October 2011, and resulted not only in the murder of Gaddafi and his overthrow, but balkanized the country into at least two different parts that are being run by two different militia groups. And now slavery is, probably many of you know, there are now slaves being sold in public markets in Libya. So congratulations, United States. And as what happened was then the U.S. started using the arms from Libya to arm these jihadists in Syria, again, over a very long period of time. And at times, in fact, a group that the CIA was supporting was fighting a group that the Defense Department was fighting. That's how crazy the whole thing was. But that was all to the good, because as I've been saying for some time, the order of the day for the United States, the U.S., for a long time, they're big in the Western colonial powers, and that's what they are. Their big modus operandi was to support strongmen in various global South countries to protect their economic interests. But then they decided at some point, I think one of the first countries they decided in is one that's never covered, and that's the Congo, now known as the Democratic Republic of Congo. The U.S. supported Mobutu after they murdered Patrice Lumumba, the first democratically elected prime minister of Congo. They put in place Mobutu Sese Seko and supported his brutal dictatorship for years. But then they discovered something about Mobutu and other like leaders. Even as, compliant as they are in supporting U.S. economic interests, they still, in order to keep power, have to do something for their own people, right? Tax things once in a while, provide some social services, etc. So they got rid of Mobutu, and really since that time have ensured that the Democratic Republic of Congo is ungoverned, that it is essentially a lawless country where resources are being plundered, children are being forced to work to mine our minerals that are in our cell phones, etc. And they have found that that type of anarchy is the most fertile for super exploitation. So again, in a place like Syria, the fact that one group that the state Defense Department is supporting is fighting one that the CIA is supporting, it's all to part of the design, because it's not to put in a government that will rule a country one way or another. It's to prevent a state from even existing. And really, that's what you have now in Syria. You have Israel, which has taken over huge swaths of the south. You have Turkey, which has taken over parts of the northwest. You have the U.S., which continues to occupy the northeast. France is now getting very deeply involved in parts of Syria. And then even parts that are not controlled by these foreign countries. You have ISIS controlling Palmyra, the ancient city of Palmyra. ISIS no longer gets along with Al Qaeda, which is now the main governing body. And you have essentially anarchy and chaos. And within that, you have, I just got off a call, just as I got on this call, I left a call with some Alawites, American Alawites, who are very concerned that the Alawites are being murdered as part of a genocidal campaign in Syria, which is true, and that Christians are as well. This is getting almost no coverage, but of course, why would this be surprising? Because the battle cry of the jihadists that the U.S. and other Western countries supported in Syria, their battle cry was Alawites to the grave, Christians to Beirut. So they were going to slaughter the Alawites and send the Christians into Beirut. And that's exactly what they're doing, to the great applause, apparently, of Western press, who has said nothing critical about the fact that Al Qaeda basically, to the extent they rule, they rule Syria at this point. And again, this is a story that is not well told. The mainstream press never told it in the way they never covered it in the way they should have. And again, now people who raise these issues, like a Tulsi Gabbard, are pilloried.
Excuse me, Dan. Excuse the interruption. You have 1 minute to finish up your thoughts.
Yes. In Lebanon, by the way, you should know they have a president for the first time in some time. They didn't have a president, and he was picked by the United States. In fact, the U.S. ambassador was on the floor of the parliament hand selecting the new president of Lebanon. He, in fact, you have to know, he is serving unconstitutionally because he was an active general at the time he was made president. Under the Lebanese constitution, if you have such a position, you have to be retired for at least 2 years. And what this does is prevent military rule and military coups. But the U.S., totally subverting that, handpicked the new president of Lebanon, and also, along with Saudi Arabia, picked the new prime minister of Lebanon. And I'll just end by saying this, which was a double bank shot, because it got into power someone that the U.S. and Saudi Arabia wanted. He also happened to have been, at the time he was selected, the head of the International Court of Justice, which is investigating Israel for genocide in Gaza. And so they were able to take him, make him prime minister of Lebanon, and put as the new head of the ICJ the Ugandan representative who doesn't think there's genocide happening in Gaza. So again, this is how the U.S. manipulates these countries and the world. And those are my thoughts. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Just look at how many books Daniel has written on this topic. He knows a thing or two about the anarchy and chaos that U.S. wreaks all over the planet. And, you know, thankfully you shared about Syria's, I had no idea it was the largest foreign intervention budget, which says a lot relating to how much foreign military budget interventions there have been. So there's truly, you know, no end to the amount of hell that the West wreaks all over the world. So finally, we would like to introduce our dear Dr. Jill Stein. Jill is a, right here, we have her biography.
We know Jill.
We know Jill. Jill needs no introduction. So thank you, Dr. Jill. And would you like to introduce yourself or?
Sure. Yeah. And I can just introduce myself saying I know many of you and, you know, have been a part of our collective challenge to power. And I think I don't need to say anything more than that, other than that it's really such an honor to be here. And this kind of discussion makes me so proud to be a Green and to be a part of this movement. When we were given, you know, the subject for tonight, covert action, endless war, how the U.S. exports violence, you know, in my mind, what that translated to is empires falling, resistance is rising, and this is unstoppable. And that's kind of like where I go in my mind, because I feel like we have been studying, you know, and explaining for so many years, for most of our lifetimes. I very much hunger for the what to do. And as many have said tonight, there's really an extraordinary opportunity in this moment because empire is unraveling and accelerating, both abroad and at home. It really is in a state of collapse, not entirely, you know, immediate, but it's very clear where it's going, and it's been going here, you know, for decades, certainly. And so I want to kind of start off where Matt Ho left off on this question of the propaganda, specifically looking at the propaganda against us, this massive psyop being conducted against us that's intended to convince us that we are powerless, that resistance is futile, that the powers that be are so, you know, they're absolutely unchallengeable. So you might as well just kind of roll over on the railroad tracks and forget about it. But that is so exactly not true. That is very much the opposite of what's true. So I want to just kind of like remind us of that as a point of departure. And, also looking at the US empire, in a nutshell, this is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, which is what Martin Luther King said back in the 1960s. We were the greatest purveyor then, we are still the greatest purveyor now. The instruments of violence become bigger and more vicious and pervasive. That violence is military, it's economic, it's ecological, it's social, it's racial, it's colonial. And that violence of empire goes hand in hand with oligarchy, with the war on working people at home, with crushing inequality, with climate collapse and rising fascism, what Martin Luther King described really as the triple evil of militarism, racism, and capitalism, basically, all of which makes empire extremely unjust, unsustainable, unconscionable. And as this big psyop is going on, it's just really important to remind ourselves we do not consent. We do not consent, in this manufacturing of consent. We don't consent, not to Republican rule and not to Democratic rule. And for the last more than decade, there have been very clear numbers that a substantial majority, even a supermajority sometimes, really wants a third party because the two major parties have done such a poor job. This is the language that's used by Gallup in this polling, that the two major parties have done such a poor job of representing the people. Twice as many people identify as independent as either Democrat or Republican. The Joe Biden had the second lowest approval rating over the course of his presidency of any president since the end of the Second World War. The first worst rating of a president was none other than Donald Trump, which kind of tells us where we are right now. We have this leadership inflicted on us that people do not support, that people widely revile. Most people vote for the candidate they're voting for because they oppose the other one more. We're voting against who we hate the most, in a system that is working overtime to silence opponents of genocide, opponents of empire, those who are standing for a pro-worker, climate emergency, anti-oligarchy campaign. There's such an enormous effort being made right now to shut down those voices of resistance. You may not have heard yet, but I was just called by Fox News today for comment on this effort being made now by the Dog Commission, although it denigrates dogs to even use that word. But that commission is now going after public funding as well. But in fact, that's nothing new. Both parties have gone after public financing of our political campaigns for many, many years. We have been on this trajectory of, the stranglehold of billionaire money on our political system, the best democracy money can buy. We've been on that trajectory for decades, actually. And in Obama's term, we saw, before Obama, we saw the Democrats leading the charge for NAFTA and for the offshoring of so many millions of jobs. Under Obama, we saw the massive Wall Street bailouts while homeowners were thrown out to the tune of millions of homeowners. Under Bill Clinton, we saw the omnibus crime bill, which opened the floodgates to mass incarceration of people of color. We saw the whole-scale repeal of the social safety net. Speaking of which, we're hearing a lot now about how the Republicans, the Congress in particular, is attacking Medicaid, and is attacking food stamps, among other things. But just to look at those two things alone, it's pointed out by a wonderful economist named Stephen Semler, who puts out usually a weekly heads up, which is amazing. It's worth looking him up if you don't know about him. But he makes the point that these crushing initiatives that Republicans are leading the way right now are actually very small compared to what Joe Biden himself did, who actually cut 24 million people off of the Medicaid expansion when he didn't need to. That's far more damage than what the Republicans are even contemplating right now. On food stamps, likewise the same. There will be about twice as many who were thrown off of food stamps by these purely optional programs that Joe Biden undertook, which he didn't need to do. Is actually far worse what was done to food stamps, which were keeping like some 4.5 million people out of poverty that were thrown back into poverty by the steps that Biden took. And likewise on student debt, you may remember that Joe Biden did not need to reinstitute, basically to stop the pause. Trump had paused student debt payments during the COVID emergency. Those were put on hold. Biden inherited that hold, and for absolutely no reason other than that he wanted to, he ended that hold and again threw millions more people back into poverty. So yes, what the Republicans are doing is absolutely terrible, but what the Democrats have done is also absolutely terrible. And the same thing is true on foreign policy, of course. And just to to say what the consequence of this, the consequence of the Democrats' policies, they're very, anti-worker, anti-youth, anti-communities of color, with poverty rates tripling, actually. Again, under Joe Biden, poverty rates among children tripled. Poverty among African Americans is twice the rate of the rest of the American population. The consequence of that was that the Democrats lost 1,000 seats in state legislatures. They lost 64 seats in Congress. They lost 12 seats in the Senate, and they lost 12 governorships. So that's
Excuse the
where this is
interruption,
coming
Jill,
from.
but you have 1 minute to finish your thoughts.
Great. Terrific. All right. So I did not get to foreign policy, but I feel like a lot of others, have done a really beautiful job of addressing that. And we're watching right now Trump, who promised that he was going to bring peace to Gaza. Now what he's bringing is ethnic cleansing, which will certainly bring more genocide, because Palestinians are not going to go just because it's the U.S. that's now telling them that we own their land. And in fact, Trump wants to do his real estate development, which is just absolutely disgusting and shocking. We're seeing Israel accelerate its war on the West Bank. There've been over almost 100 deaths in the West Bank since the so-called peace agreement in Gaza. There have been over 100 deaths in Gaza, people killed by the IDF since the peace treaty. You have Israel that's now refusing to leave Lebanon and ramping up its assault on communities in Syria. So this is not going away. Trump has made some rather shocking statements like that we should all cut our militaries in half, and he's going to talk to Russia and to China and propose that we all cut our militaries in half. And wouldn't that be great? And that we should all pull back from nuclear weapons and certainly not build more and maybe get rid of them. So, there's some really interesting things in the mix right now, but, the proof is in the action. It's not in the statements, and none of us should be letting our guard down. But at the end of the day, we have an amazing opportunity, especially to organize around the the state of emergency that working people are in this country, because well, and likewise, there are many people for whom Gaza and genocide and the endless war machine, which is impoverishing us. The average household is paying $12,000 in the most recent year, in 2024, according to Jeffrey Sachs's back of the napkin calculations. So the endless war empire is impoverishing us here at the same time that it is endangering people the world over. So we do have an amazing opportunity right now to organize and to reject the propaganda that tells us that we are powerless, that we can do nothing about this. In fact, we are powerful. The American people are really in a state of rebellion against oligarchy, against rule by billionaires and the rich, and the costs of empire. So we have a lot to do together, and we are just getting started. And I just want to also shout out a big thank you to Butch Ware for taking this challenge right to the empire. This is kind of an example very much of where our struggle needs to be. Thank you so much. Back to you, Nora.
Yay. Thank you so much, Dr. Jill, and to both you and Butch for your wonderful and unapologetic leadership during this time. You both have breathed life back into the Green Party when we so desperately needed it. And really looking forward to continuing these conversations, and both of your calls to action. I think those are really critical. And yeah, so much we can do in this moment. And with that, I think we are going to take some questions. Madeline, did you want to start off?
Yes, yes, there are a number of questions that have come in, but I'm going to take the first one that I saw, and it was directed specifically to Butch Ware, and it was right in line with what Jill was just talking about, taking care of those things that the U.S. population needs to have addressed here at home. Not just spend money on military operations abroad. So the question was something, I'm paraphrasing it a little because it was a long question, and we'll have 2 minutes to respond to it, just so that you know, so we can get more questions in. It was, what about the bread and butter issues, Butch Ware? What about the high rents, the cost of housing and food and utilities? Someone else added healthcare a little bit later on. And the gross or tremendous income inequality. What do you propose to do about those?
Yeah. So I encourage people to go to www.butchwareforgov.com. You can see, sort of a sketch of the policy positions. You can also check out my social media, but I'll give a brief answer to the question. So I did a radio show in LA on single payer healthcare. Obviously, the debraining of a United Healthcare executive in downtown Manhattan dramatized for a lot of people what many of us have already known, which is that the healthcare industry is actually an extractive, rent-seeking, racket that does not provide either health or care. Instead, it takes rents and puts people to death. So single payer healthcare has actually come very close to passing in California multiple times in the past. The most recent time, literally $1 million from the insurance industry to the Democratic Party scuttled the passage of this when they have super majorities, in the local decision-making bodies in the state of California. So bringing back single payer healthcare is a top line item. And it actually, I can talk about affordable housing. I can talk about some of the other pieces, but let me just give a couple things on this one. General Motors spends more on healthcare than it spends on steel. by actually putting universal health care into the state of California, you can make California businesses more competitive, you can stimulate job growth, and you can especially advantage small business owners against large business owners, because right now only economies of scale are able to provide health care for employees. You can also free up the organized labor movement to stop spending all its time on collective bargaining, working for health care and benefits, and get them working on wages and working conditions the way that you ought to. So you can have a bunch of secondary economic and social benefits that come with tackling this core issue. Making polluters pay, of course, for the environmental degradation that takes place in the state, which you now see expressed in these wildfires. And you see the Democrats, instead of proposing reasonable reconstruction plans, they are essentially turning things over to real estate developers for gentrification. So building affordable housing units and using a model like, for example, what's used in Vienna, where 43% of the market in that city for rental is actually state-owned properties, and that keeps the rest of the market from running away and hiding, and also provides affordable housing opportunities for people. So we're thinking about single-payer healthcare, free tuition for for higher education, protecting immigrant rights and communities, focusing on renewable, sustainable energy. The first 8 items on the platform have nothing to do with foreign policy. But since this was a peace, summit and a peace conversation, I just wanted to make it clear that divestment as a state is a powerful economic and political tool towards advancing the cause of peace. The last part that I'll say is that if you can make manifest these kinds of social and political transformations in the state of California, if you separated the 50 states out to independent countries, California would be the 5th largest economy in the world. The GDP of the state of California is twice that of the next highest state in the union, which is Texas. So if we can hit hard in the state of California and get serious returns in the electoral process, it is going to make a transformative intervention in the broader politics nationally on all of these issues. And if we ever pass single payer healthcare in the state of California, then that means it's going to pass nationwide, because that's exactly what happened in Canada. One province passed single payer healthcare, and before long, the whole country had it. It will also give us a position to negotiate against pharmaceutical companies for bulk purchases. So we have policy teams that are literally breaking down each of these pieces so we can find the most appropriate, effective short-term intervention and
Thank you,
the
Butch.
long-term
Thank
plan.
you. That's
Sorry, I know I went long, pardon me.
It's really hard to keep people like us limit to a limited time.
Appreciate
It's
it.
very hard. I can relate. And thank you, Jim. I do want to open, see if anyone else on the panel, Jill or Daniel or Matthew, wants to answer that question. Because I know you all, well, Jill and Matthew have run for political office. I don't know about Daniel, but if you want to answer that question about the bread and butter issues, just let me know. Jill, you want to answer it? Okay.
Yeah, I'll just add briefly that, and I presume this is part of Butch's, larger platform as well. There are a whole series of things, low-hanging fruit on the housing emergency, and it is an emergency. We have, by the way, something like 20 times the number of empty homes as we have unhoused people. We got a lot of housing. It's just not available for people. We've got, gentrification. Profits of the real estate developers are the main goal of our housing policy. Simply by implementing rent control, we can, mandatory rent control, we can stabilize the escalating housing costs through a a tenant's bill of rights. We can ensure that people are not tossed out of their homes by landlords who just want to raise the rent on them. And we can also build towards social housing, particularly by taxing corporations and the wealthy. We can ensure that there are dollars to build, the housing that we need, which should be, should be multifamily housing that conserves space and which has public transportation and which is sustainably built, so that developing housing should not be an excuse for sprawl and for, further taxing an environment that's already really over the cliff. So this is not rocket science. This is simply about having people running for office who are accountable to people, not to real estate developers.
Thank you.
If I could just add, I
Yes.
think more the idea here about covert actions in this type of intelligence military operations and how that's used overseas, but also too here at home. And looking at these cuts to government, what's not going to be cut? The Pentagon and the intelligence services. Well, there's a quid pro quo there, right? These elites are going to protect one another. I can't remember in which order it is. The House Republican budget plan, I think, is $150 billion more a year for the Pentagon. The Senate Republican budget plan is about $100 billion. I mean, I think those are the numbers we know right now. So there will be a quid pro quo, a transactional thing where the intelligence services and the military will protect those that are protecting them. Right. I think that's pretty obvious. And how does that look in action? I've got a story in my mind from the other day, about 10 years ago. This is not in the US, but in Canada, but the story is the same. KKR, the private equity fund, went to the Canadian government and they said, we've got all this money invested in these pipelines out in Western Canada. We think you should be using these type of counterinsurgency tactics against the pipeline protectors. And they sure enough did. RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, started adapting counterinsurgency tactics against the pipeline protectors. Who's on the board of directors for KKR? David Petraeus, right? And those of us who were out at Standing Rock, remember the American military contractor Tiger Swan came in, right? So these things that we talk about externally, things that we think are pointed outwards, we know that they've been pointed at our public, and we can only expect them to be further utilized to protect the elites. And, this is what we're up against.
Absolutely. It's interesting to see what's going to happen. Some people say we may not even have another election if these guys get it their way, because they're, been moving towards this format of government that does not involve people voting and speaking for democratically. Anyways, there's a lot of questions here that we want to get through, and I'm not sure that we'll be able to get to them all, but I just want to pick out some more general ones to make sure that we hear from everyone, and whoever wants to respond. I think a really important one is that where do all the speakers get and nurture moral courage within themselves and for others at this time? Anybody want to take that? Good.
I mean, I'm someone that's been on the record and speaking about this quite a bit. That I think that it's incredibly important, that we root ourselves in our spiritual traditions and our cultural traditions, that we work on healing ourselves as individual instruments before we enter into a space of change in the world, that we can change all of the structures that we want to, but if we're still broken, then we are going to reproduce the brokennesses that empire has inscribed in us. So for me, that means the West African Sufi tradition. For someone else, it might mean Native American spirituality. For others, it might mean meditation. But I think that it's incredibly important that we realize that the instrument that we use to effect liberation is the whole of ourselves, and that we take care of that whole entire self. And bring that into the space. And one, just I'll turn that very positive and uplifting, intervention into a slightly snarky and critical one, which is that you do see in the leftist space a lot of people that come in with a lot of ego investments and ideological positions and just sort of batter one another, because we're not always necessarily doing the work of healing and keeping in mind that revolutions are rooted in love. They're rooted in compassion. They're rooted in not being able to accept seeing our brothers and sisters in the human family suffering needlessly. And that comes from being in a place of being centered in the rituals and traditions and ideas and practices that make you whole as a human being. So that's my answer to that question.
Thank you so much for that. And I need to, I have a hard stop at 6 my time, but I just wanted to add to that because I think this is probably one of the most important points in this moment. In my 23 years of organizing, I have never seen us so divided, honestly, as a movement in terms of like canceling each other and others that have been, putting their lives and their livelihoods on the line, being left hung out to dry. And this is one of the most concerning things to me in this moment, is that the state doesn't even need to do the work for us when we leave our own people behind like that. It's really shocking and very upsetting. So I just want to close by saying that, the in this moment that we need to continue having these conversations and find ways to overcome our differences and truly stand together in principled solidarity to fight back with strategies against this state repression through, just mobilizing a united front against fascism. And just that our primary task today is build communities of care and principled solidarity with workers and students and everyone who's fighting back and has been retaliated against. And that means, building towards a global strike and people's arms embargo. And I think, just all the ways that we can do that. I think we need a whole another webinar for that. But also just continuing to expose these contradictions and exploit them and putting a wrench in the machine every chance we can is our task and calling in the coming years ahead. So thank you all so much for being here and all of your contributions. Look forward to building with you in the future.
Thank you, Nora, for co-moderating with me. We're not leaving. I'll take it past, for another 10, 15 minutes, and then we'll have closing statements, which you just gave, Nora. You gave your own, and as well as a great answer to the question. I wish we had more time. Nora had told me early, Friday, that she would have to leave at 6 o'clock her time, hard stop. And a lot of condolences for Nora. It's a family member, a funeral of a extended family member. So
our family patriarch, a dear uncle. So yeah, blessings to him and all of our ancestors whose shoulders we ride on and carry us forward. Thank you all so much for your work.
And thank you. So if anyone else, Jill or Matthew or Dan, want to answer that question about where you get the moral courage to keep on working at this particular time?
Yeah, I'll take that. I mean, I don't consider myself particularly courageous, but I'll just say that, my work, I feel, is rooted in, love for not just humanity, but, real human beings. I have friends in Gaza. I have friends in Syria. I have friends all over the world who are victims of U.S. empire. And I've tried to maintain those relationships because I do think, these are not abstractions. it's important to do the political work, but it's also, important to remember every day that there's real human beings who are dying and suffering due to our government's misdeeds, funded by our own tax dollars. And I do feel a moral compulsion to do something about that. And I have since I was a very young person. I was very just painfully aware, as Jill Stein said, Dr. Jill Stein said very rightly, that the U.S. is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. Of course, Martin Luther King said that, I believe, in 1967, and it's as true today as it was then. In fact, it's more true. And given the truth of that, I feel I must do something. And honestly, if I did nothing, I wouldn't be able to sleep at night. At least now I have some peace of mind that I'm trying to do something against, great evil. And that's how I view it. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Jill or Matthew.
Go ahead, Matthew.
Oh, I would assume that, there's a lot of it for me, aspects of my own past, why I do this work, what I've seen, uh, my time in government, both military and civilian, being Forrest Gump-like and being around very high positions and seeing who those people are and not willing to let them get away with it. And you top that off with there's no other alternative. And then you finish that off, I guess, with, even if we're not successful, we go down swinging. And I think that's a lot of what encompasses why I do these things.
So now it's time for our closing statements after this webinar tonight. And I would just, we will start with a closing statement from Dan Kovalik.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you everyone for joining tonight. I saw there was about 100 people on the call, which is great. I just would say that we're in I think, a very pivotal moment in human history where literally the choice of humanity is between survival and extinction, between, nuclear war and peace. And that is, people of conscience, have to fight for peace. That sounds strange to say, but we have to work for it. We need to go in the streets for it. We need to demand peace in Ukraine and the Middle East, also known as West Asia. We have to stop the genocide in Gaza and the West Bank. And really, we have the privilege of being Americans who live in the belly of the beast, as Che Guevara said. It's our government that is committing this violence around the world. And so it's up to us to stop it. And I think the Green Party has a big role in doing that. So I hope that people will support the Green Party, support the fight against this really duopoly that controls Washington, controls the U.S., and really controls the world. Thank you.
I think what's the biggest danger with the covert operations are that the things that are most innocuous that are used for the U.S. empire are the most insidious. And USAID has been in the news quite a bit since Donald Trump and Elon Musk defunded it and basically eliminated it. Something will come from it. But, it's well understood the role USAID plays in the national security state, certainly, again, as a front for regime change. And it's always been that way. It wasn't as if the CIA said, oh, look at this USAID thing, let's use it. No, immediately, as soon as it's created, President Kennedy creates it in 1961, and immediately it's utilized for U.S. Intelligence purposes. For example, by 1963, nearly every USAID officer in South Vietnam is actually a CIA officer. But even more so, more than the regime change, the role that USAID has played, the overall role of using humanitarian assistance and development assistance to aid the empire is clear. Whether you look at a study came out this summer from the new political economy. It said that since 1960, $150 trillion has been extracted from the global south, or it's something that Oxfam put out last month that the richest 1% earn $30 million an hour from the global south. You see that what's occurring here is an input of resources of, again, aid, assistance, whatever you want to call it, into the global south in order to sustain it, in order to extract, right? So essentially keeping the host alive. So very parasitic. And, so depending upon different estimates, you can find different estimates for this on the internet. Oxfam said for every dollar the West puts into the global south, it extracts 4. That new political economy report said for every dollar the West puts into the global south, it extracts 14. You see how that works, right? So in the purposes of empire, utilizing humanitarian aid and disaster assistance and development assistance, serve this larger role of ensuring that the developing world can be exploited, resources and wealth can be extracted, all again for the purpose of the empire. So I appreciate you having me join you in this, and I look forward to getting any feedback from people. Love to talk with people in the future about this.
Moral courage. It's being plugged into a community that really affirms, for me, our humanity. And there are lots of places out there in this corporatized world that do not affirm our humanity and that constantly destroy and offend our humanity. So for me, being part of a resistance community and a loving community and a caring community is really, for me, it is transformative. And where so that's the positive, part of it. And then there's the other side, which is that I experience great sadness and hopelessness without being part of a change community. So I can't live in that world, and I can't live in that. We all live in that world, but I can't live in it without fighting it. And so I have to fight it. And for me, the wake up, there were lots of wake ups along the way. The war in Vietnam was a big wake up for me. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X were big wake ups for me. And then becoming a healthcare provider was a big wake up, because I began to see, oh my God, we're all dying here. We are all kind of part of this collapse of our collective community health. It's going down the tubes really fast in this country. Uniquely among the developed world, we're really in bad shape. And when I began to see how this predatory, extractive, colonialist approach to our physical world, our water, our air, our food, really is sickening us every day, in every way. I began to realize, oh my God, this is a matter of our physical survival too, that we have to fight this. And for years, I kind of went into the field of environmental health and documenting these connections. And then I began to feel like, oh my God, I'm just documented how we are self-destructing. I can't do that. I have to try to change that. And so that's just given me unstoppable resolve to fix it. The genocide in Gaza gives me a huge amount of resolve and the courage and grace of that community that is affirming its humanity constantly while being genocided. For me, that is a huge, just it's renewal to be a part of that. So those are all things that for me make it impossible not to do this work and make this work inherently very healing. And then I find I have to take time out to, be out in nature, to be with my cat and my dog and my family when I can. I have to make time to do that because for decades I just was riveted on the cause, and you just can't keep living that way. So you really do have to
Thank you.
take time to heal yourself.
Thank you so much, Jill. And as we can move to Butch, and then I want to say a couple of closing words as well.
I think that the way that I would, offer a closing in this gathering, is I was minding my own business, teaching, organizing, leading protests, speaking at other people's protests, organizing, doing online intensives in the Muslim community, connecting spirituality and social justice. And we would keep reaching this point where, like, what's the next move? Where do we go from here? How do we, make the next step? And so getting pulled in, to Jill's campaign, and, realizing that, like, there are so many people that are in similar communal spaces that are just hammering away at the system from inside their own little piece of the world. And that if we can just actually start to link together some of these silos and start to think about, and again, it comes back to Malcolm. Malcolm said, we are not outnumbered, we are out organized. And I started to realize that we actually in the Green Party have this incredible opportunity, that the Republicans were getting 2% of the vote, as an abolitionist party, and then the Whigs collapsed, and Lincoln was in the White House 6 years later. And I think that the Democratic Party is going to collapse underneath the weight of this genocide. And I think that if we can just build and organize, and as Malcolm said, never let your enemy tell you how many of you there are. I think that there's so many rooms just like this one. So I'm incredibly hopeful in this moment. And then I'm also hopeful because I actually realize, I believe this to the core of my being, that humanity is capable of better than this, that we actually have everything that we need to provide not just for the basic needs of every single human being, but for abundance for every single human being. But we are weighted down with imperialist, capitalist, extractive systems that distribute resources incredibly poorly. And that if we just model care, and goodness and responsible governance, and if we are willing to fight like hell to establish it, then we can make the intervention in our time that will be transformative. If you fix what's wrong with the United States of America, you go a long way to fixing what's wrong with humanity as a whole, and you transform the destiny and the future of every single person in this human family. So, like, that's what I'm here for, to fight like hell, to establish that hope. So that's why, I hope everybody can, like, pitch in, connect your networks in your communities to what we're trying to do in California, because I'm literally willing to be like the point of the spear, for this attack, and I'm gonna go at them. So I look forward to, to like fighting shoulder to shoulder with everybody in this room and all of the rooms that you guys are connected to, going forward.
Thank you so much, Butch. And on behalf of GPACs, I want to thank all of our speakers, and I want to thank all of the people who attended. We had over 100 at a number of points, so I think we had maybe 115, maybe 120 coming in and out, shuffling through. And I just want to add, as the co-chair of GPACs and a person who now lives south of the border in Colombia, that what both Jill and Butch and Matthew have said really resonates with me, because people in Colombia and throughout Latin America are victims, have been victims of US imperialism since the Monroe Doctrine. And that's involved extracting resources, and not only extracting the resources, but the money from those resources have been taken out of Latin America. And if there's anything I can do, well, one of the reasons I'm here is to help build those bridges between North and South and Central America. We all have to look at the fact that it's not just the United States that calls itself America, that is America. All of us are Americanos. Yes, stealing resources, I see here. And so the more we can internalize that we're not, there's no border, physical or intellectual or mental, amongst the people in North, Central, and South America, the better off we'll be. And we will be sending out a recording of this entire webinar once we fix the ending of it, which was unfortunate, but we overcame it, didn't we? We overcame it, and so thanks to everyone for your participation, your patience, and your work, your good hard work. And we will continue it from here on in. Good night.